Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Rose, CEO and founder of WiseHer. We provide on demand expert advice to help small businesses, entrepreneurs, and professionals accelerate their business or career growth. Our nearly 1,000 experts from around the world help small businesses, entrepreneurs, and professionals with affordable one on one advice that helps them go farther, faster in their business or career. And today, I'm very excited to have with me on this Get Wise Wednesday attorney Shahara Wright. She is a business and nonprofit law attorney and business strategist who works with established small business owners and founders looking to sustain and scale their business. She's an award-winning author of From Entrepreneur to CEO and international speaker. And she was recently named Houstonia's top lawyer of 2022. So congratulations and welcome, Shahara.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And of course, you can find Shahara's profile. We're going to put her WiseHer profile link into the chat. But let's get started a little bit. Just kind of explain to the audience, how did you end up deciding to go into small business law, as a specialty?
So I took a course in law school. It's a required course. So your first year of law school, you have these set required courses. And one of the courses was business entities. And I had never even considered doing this type of work before I took this class. And for whatever reason, it just was like, it was like, everything. I was like, I love the whole idea of it. I love the whole idea of business. And so I started taking courses with regards to transactional work and things like that. So I knew that that is something that I wanted to do. So when I graduated from law school, I couldn't find a job. I applied like everywhere that I could possibly apply to. Ended up getting some work with a family lawyer, which I knew I didn't want to do. I hated it. Did that for about 9 months. And then I just said, you know what? I said I wanted to do work with small businesses and I wanted to work with nonprofits. So that's what I'm going to do. So I started my own practice about a year after I was licensed, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Wow, fantastic. And one of the things that, just being involved with small business community for me almost 15 years now, what there are two things people usually skimp out on when they start a business. One is accountants, right? The financial setup, because everyone kind of thinks they can do that themselves.
Right.
And of course, the second is legal. And it's not even so much that they think they could do it themselves. It's so expensive.
Right.
And when you're getting started, $1,000 to set up an entity it could be, it could be prohibitive. But I want to just talk to you, a little bit about that and get your feedback on, I know we've talked about this before, like you pay now or pay later, but what are the things that you really see and the challenges that small businesses face, and what do you see that you or an attorney can help them with?
Well, I think when you're first starting out, obviously everything, depends upon budgets. And you're right, when you start out, professional services usually is the one that gets left behind. And I'm generally okay with that in the sense that I think that you can at least afford a consultation, and consultations aren't, thousands of dollars. Depending upon, my hourly rate is $3.75. When I first started back in the Stone Ages, I charged like $75 for an hour. So, and I still had experience, and I still, had understanding of, some general, basics, at least enough to get someone that was just starting out. So if you, with maybe a younger attorney or someone that hasn't been practicing that long, if you, just starting out, the basics about an LLC versus a corporation, some of those basics, you can afford at least one consultation, with an attorney to at least understand what you need to know
Right.
about some business basics. So I think that, you don't have to start off at this top law firm that's, charging, $500, dollars an hour and feel like, that's what you need for your business. You can, there's lawyers at every level. And I think that you can find someone that will fit within your budget to at least get some advice. And that would be the thing that I would say. Get the advice, even if you don't hire them to actually do the actual service.
Yeah. And of course they can, speak with our legal advisors on WiseHer as well.
Yes.
But, So let's talk a little bit about that specific thing, because I hear that so much. And what's interesting is there's a lot of information online versus, for LLC versus S Corp and C Corp. But, I still keep getting the questions, and I know we get them on Wise Her a lot too. So, and I guess there's so many like it depends kind of things too. But this is kind of an overview. Give us a little bit of an insight into the LLC versus the C Corp and S Corp and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it definitely depends, a standard lawyer answer, right? Because there's nothing that's absolute. And I am just not one of those people that it's an LLC fits all type of, attorney. I think that there are certain circumstances. LLCs are really good for small businesses where there's one or two owners. You can even have, 25 owners, but it's the structure is really small, closed. You're not really looking for a bunch of investors. You're not going to be changing members, owners all the time, because the way that LLCs are structured, they're not really set up to be that fundraising type of entity. So I very rarely, and I don't think that they're the best entity for that, to do fundraising. I know some people use it for that, but it becomes convoluted because it's not structured for that. So when you're looking at trying to do fundraising, meaning you're bringing in investors and things like that, a corporation or a limited partnership would be better than doing that for an LLC. But an LLC, if you've got 1, 2, 5 people, same people are going to be owning the business. You're not looking to be changing in and out. I think it's a good entity for that. It's simple because you have a management structure that you can choose based on what you want. So you can have the members who are the owners. You can have it member managed, meaning the owners manage it. You can have it manager managed, meaning you can choose to have a manager that's kind of like a board of directors for shareholders. For corporations, and then you can choose to have officers. So you have all these options that you can structure it in a way that makes sense for how your business is working. So I think that that's a good entity for that. With corporations, like we talked about, being able to do fundraising, it's really good. If you're planning on doing business, internationally, anywhere outside the US, I think a corporation is best, because understand that all these entities are not made equal, right? Even LLCs don't operate the same in states, much less in another country where the version of LLC may or may not exist. Okay. So then you want something that people know, or you can take it somewhere else and be consistent. And every country has some version of a corporation that's probably not too different from where it is in the United States. So then if you're talking about doing business internationally, having something like a corporation would probably be best.
Makes more sense.
Yeah. And then lastly, the difference between an S and a C is a tax designation. I know people always think an S corporation and a C corporation is a different type of entity. It's not, right? It's not an entity. It's how your organization is taxed. And really, that's a good conversation to have with the CPA as to whether or not you need to be taxed as an S corporation or a C corporations. LLCs and corporations have those options. A C corporation really just means that the corporation itself is paying taxes. And if you make what we call a distribution to the profits to the individual shareholders, those shareholders will pay taxes on that. So that creates what we call a double taxation, which isn't necessarily bad, but just depending upon where you are in your business, it may not be the best option. An S corp is really just a pass-through, meaning that the corporation itself doesn't pay taxes. The profits pass through the entity to the individual shareholders. So I hope I didn't lose you guys on that.
Yeah. No. So it sounds, but what it sounds like is, and we'll dive a little bit more into the LLC, because I know that's a big, a little bit of a different conversation. But it sounds what you're saying. The C corp and the S corp are essentially the same entity. It's a taxation situation between the two, and that is again why the investment in, the professional services like a CPA or something makes sense, because it sounds like it's less of a legal question and more of a tax question. Is that right?
Absolutely. So usually what I tell my clients when they come to me and we're talking about formation and we're discussing whether or not to be taxed as an S corp or a C corp, I say, get your CPA on the phone and let's have a conversation with that. about
Okay.
that.
Okay.
And so we can talk about what's happening within the entity to see where you need to be, because I don't like making those decisions. I know enough about taxes to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And so I always say, hey, let's bring the CPA in on this conversation.
Okay. And then let's kind of switch back to the LLC. So one of the things is being in this space for a very long time, I noticed that, women in particular, 88% are under 100,000 in revenue, 90% are under 5 employees, more like solopreneurs. And even, with small businesses in general, it's in the 40% range, but women and people of color, it's usually more sole proprietorships and things like that. So talk a little bit about, sometimes you start off, right? You're a coach or you're doing something and you don't even form an entity, right? So talk a little bit about like a sole proprietor versus an LLC and maybe some of the pitfalls of being a sole proprietor versus incorporating in some way.
So I'll frame it in this way. It's really a matter of liability, right? So one is you have a shield, kind of like this circle that's kind of encompassing you, right? You're inside the circle and the circle is around you. That would be having an LLC or a corporation or some kind of entity that separates you from any liability of the company. When you have a sole proprietorship, you don't have that circle around you, right? You don't have a shield. So there's no distinction between you individually and the business. Now, that's not always bad. What I tell people is like, listen, if you're, sewing pillows and, you're just doing it as a hobby for fun and selling it whenever you want to, there's just no need, to go and form, an LLC or a corporation to do that, right? It doesn't really make any sense. Sometimes people, they're insurance agents and maybe they're only, selling, $50,000 worth of stuff and don't really need to have this liability protection because there's really no more that the entity itself can do versus, having insurance to protect you against malpractice, right? So there's some reasons where I would say you don't have to have that LLC. So the liability protection has to come with, well, okay, you got a daycare. Well, the daycare has a lot of liabilities. So if you're only doing it as a sole proprietorship and somebody sues you, something happens, you could lose all of your assets because of something that's happening in that. If you have a lot of assets personally, and you're starting a new venture and we want to protect those assets, then we want to start a new entity to ensure that your personal assets don't get involved with whatever happens with the business in case something doesn't work out or something happens, that you don't connect those things. So that's the first conversation that I usually have in terms of whether or not we want to form something in the first place is, what does the liability look like? And then the next conversation is, how much money are we talking about? Because again, it might become a tax conversation where we need to involve the CPA and say, hey, if we're talking about $1 million business and you're still running as a sole proprietorship, which happens a lot more than you think, we need to change our entity. We need to talk about the tax structure. We need to have conversations about that. Let's talk about how to move that in. Then we want to have a conversation with the CPA as well, because now we're talking about liability and we're talking about taxes.
Got it. Okay. And then even in terms of the LLCs, I've noticed like Massachusetts, I want to say, that's where I'm based. I want to say it's like $650 a year just to have the entity in Massachusetts. And then they're like I know some folks around here, like they'll register in Las Vegas or different places. Like what's the benefit versus the challenges or whatever of setting up even though I'm in Massachusetts, like, can I set it up someplace else because it's less expensive, or maybe it's more, advantageous from a legal perspective? Like, talk a little bit about that, because I know I hear that a lot.
Yeah, so this is my personal belief. I know some attorneys don't follow the same path, so that's why I tell you it's me. Is that I think that you should set up in the state that you're operating from, and this is why. If you go to Nevada and you set up a company in Nevada and then you are actually operating in Massachusetts, you're still going to have to register in Massachusetts. Why? Because you're operating your business out of Massachusetts, meaning you're doing business in Massachusetts, which means you're going to have to register to do business there. So what sense does it make to form in Nevada when you actually are not doing any business in Nevada, but you're doing it in Massachusetts and you still have to register. So now you have, either you're doing a foreign registration or you have two registrations. It doesn't make any sense. So I always tell people, do form in the area that you are. That's what makes the most sense. So it just is too complicated, too convoluted. Sometimes people like to outsmart themselves. I don't really particularly subscribe to that. You don't have to do too much when it comes to business entities. Go where you are. That's what makes the most sense. And if you're in a state that has, high formation cost, I mean, you just in a state that has high formation costs. Whenever I get calls from California businesses, I'm like, hey, look, this is coming with a price. Make sure you're prepared for it. I mean, I think that's just the reality of the situation.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because I know I hear that a lot, especially even with the C corps. Like, we're registered in Delaware because that's where everyone, kind of said to do, and that's where a lot of places, are. But we of course have to register in Massachusetts too because we are operating
right. You got to do it in both places, and I mean, yeah, exactly.
So the other thing I wanted to dive into a little bit is, a lot of times when people start businesses, even if it's a retail, business, or, if it's a tech startup, should they be looking for different, you go to a doctor and you say, oh, I have a sinus issue, and they send you to an ear, nose, and throat specialist, right? Is it kind of the same thing in the legal profession where if I just want to form an entity and an LLC, that's kind of a general business, attorney. But if I'm like, we're a technology startup, should folks be looking for specialized attorneys in these different verticals?
I think you need a little bit of both. So myself, I act as outside general counsel for small businesses. And I would say, I'm a small business generalist, so to speak, right? I do IP work, but I don't do patents. So I do trademarks and copyrights. I don't do patents because I'm not barred by the patent. I'm not a patent barred lawyer. So then I would say, as general counsel, instead of you having to go and look for a patent attorney, right? I'm going to have my resources of patent attorneys. We talk to the patent attorneys and say, okay, these are the ones that we're going to hire, or this is the person that we're going to have, so that you're not having to go around and call, 20 different lawyers. Right. So I think that there comes a point for your business where you need to have, your legal counsel that's kind of managing your legal department, whether or not they're full-time in-house or, outside counsel like I serve, that can manage that for you. Because when you have a lot of different specialties that you have to do, that can become overwhelming that you're trying to manage 5 different lawyers. And I don't think anybody, wants to do that. So, I think you probably need a little bit of both. I mean, if you, just because you're a tech startup doesn't necessarily you need a tech specialist, right? There's some contracts and things that, I can do, like I do SaaS agreements, all of those kinds of things. But fundraising and doing SEC work and things like that, I would, say, okay, we need a specialist to come and take care of that SEC work. Let's get somebody to do that kind of stuff. So I think you kind of need a combination. Obviously, budget is a big, part of that. But I think, just kind of in that same vein as we were talking about with regards to, how to budget for that, I think you have to budget for your legal as well. And to be able to start putting into what you need to have a part of your budget.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to really dive into a little bit in this interview is this idea of partnerships, right? So a lot of folks, when they first start out, they're like, oh, let's do this together, and they, whether it's an LLC or even with a startup where they're looking for co-founders and things like that. So just in a general sense, if people are looking to form these types of relationships, because I know they're a little bit different in an LLC than they are in an S corp or C corp, and you can, obviously talk about that because you're a lawyer and I'm not. But I'm just saying, like, in general. And one of the things I remember when I was looking at a partnership a while ago, and it was like, you have to make sure that you get divorced before you get married.
Mm-hmm.
So outside of the legal piece of it, like, talk a little bit about that, because I'm certain you see that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, partnership, the word partnership is very general, broad term, right? In a legal sense, when you use the word partnership, and I know it's not necessarily true in a marketing sense. So, those marketers out there, when you use the word partnerships, probably makes us lawyers' ears bleed because it means something completely in a legal sense, it means something completely different. So basically, when you have a partnership, it just means that you have agreed to share profit and losses, right? That's really what a partnership is, and that can be formed so easily that, let's just say you and I, Catherine, agree that we are going to do a little something, and we say yes, we're going to share the profits and losses on that. We have formed a partnership, right? Okay. It's just that simple. That's the keys you can do. So it can be done orally, can do done in written. You can have contracts that show that. You can have something much more formal, like you said, with the LLC or the corporation, which takes it away from the legal sense of a partnership, right? Because a partnership is a legal term where there's different types of partnerships. And then once you create an LLC or corporation, you no longer have a partnership entity, right? Even if it's what you're calling it. So it's a very broad term that has very specific legal ramifications when you use it. What I tell people when we're talking about partnerships is I totally agree, and that you have to think about the divorce first, right? Like, how are you going to get out of it? That is the first conversation I have. I always start with the termination, because I think the termination really goes around what happens with all the rest of it, right? So you have a clear idea as if somebody wants out or somebody needs to get out or whatever. How do we handle that? Because that split is always the messiest part, and it never goes according to plans. And I always tell people, just because you grew up together in a crib and y'all best friends and y'all never fight, like, people will fight over $5. So you have to have that stuff clear before you do anything, because once you don't have that money figured out, it becomes a problem.
Got it. Okay. Because I mean, 50% of all marriages fail or something, never mind, when you're adding business. I mean, at least, and in that case, like, there's some benefits, you know what I mean?
Yes,
maybe you have kids or whatever. But in a business, it's like, if somebody just can't, fulfill their part of it, I think those are really important conversations. I made that mistake, many, many years ago. I formed my very first entity, and I had partners, and it did not end well. And, I mean, there's lots of reasons for it, but it didn't. So learn from my mistakes. And I think that, you having those conversations, I think it makes people uncomfortable, but it also saves you a lot of headache in the end, because Absolutely. If the person that you're wanting to partner with is not, kind of rowing in the same direction, or is as committed to the business as you are, mm-hmm. that can be a major, major red flag. And you need to kind of address it before it becomes a challenge in the future. But that's great advice. So, and one other just quick thing before, because we're almost running out of time, but what are the biggest, I guess, pitfalls you see small businesses make, and just give us an idea of, how we can avoid these challenges?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest thing is not having legal agreements. Not having those contracts in place is a big thing. Like you said, sometimes people don't want to talk about it. They just thought it was just a handshake deal. Oh, it's just simple. And then it becomes, when you end it, it becomes a whole nasty fight. So I think the first thing is not having legal agreements in place. And so I think that that's something that, as small business owners, we definitely need to do. I think the next thing I would say is not really paying attention to what's happening in the operations of your business. So a lot of times I have clients that are so focused on the marketing, and I'm not saying at all that marketing isn't important. So please, don't send me letters about how
it's like, don't
right.
Marketing video. We know marketing's important. Yeah.
It's important. But what's also important is operations, because I have seen clients who have grown so fast, but didn't have the operations, that their business imploded because they couldn't keep up with what was actually happening, because they had no systems in place. So then they weren't able to fulfill, clients' needs. They weren't able to do what they needed to do in terms of hiring with employees. They didn't, they were having all kinds of problems inside of the business because there was nothing there to support the volume that they had. And this can happen and it's not about being $1 million or $1 billion business, right? This can happen at any level of your business, right? When you don't have the systems in place, you don't have the operations in place, it will cause problems. So when I was litigating and I would go to court, 90% of the litigation that we had with my clients was because the operations were off. Something wasn't happening that should have been happening, and it caused a lawsuit. And so those are the things that I think really matter when it comes to being able to sustain your business. And that's very important. And then 3, I think, is not paying attention to your numbers and not understanding what you actually have and what's actually going on in the business and being able to make decisions about that. So when I bring on my clients and we're talking about onboarding, one of the first things I ask is, do you have a CPA? Okay, if you have a CPA, we need to have a meeting. We need to have a talk. And we need to all 3 be here, and whoever else you want to have, you need to make sure that we have, so that we can have a conversation about what's going on in the business. Because if your money isn't right, no matter how much you feel like you're making, if you're making, 3 million, but you're losing 5 million, something is wrong, right? So we need to be able to be clear about that. And then lastly, I would say is just making sure that you have proper insurance, which is also something that I think, because it can be expensive, just like lawyers, right? Insurance can be expensive, but making sure you have the right insurance that fits your business, because not having that insurance is something you sued or something goes wrong and you don't have that protection, it can definitely end your business. So that would be my top 4.
Okay. Yeah. So, because I'm sure you see all of these things, coming in and out of all the businesses that you've worked with, which, not all of those are actually legal things, but at the end of the day can have a major, major impact on the business. So it's important that everyone, at least understands that. It's easy to stick your head in the sand, but at the end of the day, sometime you're gonna have to poke your head out and realize that it's not working the way you wanted it to work, and this is probably why. So that's really, really great advice. We are out of time, but thank you, Shahara. Thank you so much for joining us today. And those of you out there, if you want to get a deeper dive on your business entity setup or any sort of general legal questions, go ahead and head over to Shahara's profile on wiseher.com, and we'll be putting that link into the chat area. But of course, if you have any other burning career or business questions, we are here to help at wiseher.com. So thanks again, Shahara, for spending some time with us today. And we'll see you all next time on Ask the Expert Live. If you want to keep up with us and learn more about our next guest and our next show, head over to goasktheexpert.com and get on the list. Thanks, everyone.